So let me thank the three speakers for offering us such informative presentations, and I open the floor for questions. Sir?
Steve Johnson, the co-roundtable. I was just noticing that in the quote from the Holy Father program, he makes the connection between religious freedom and the possibility of secular citizenship. So I'd like to ask Professor Griffith for a comment. When you think about, in the Muslim context, finding right guidance for religious tolerance, one alternative is to argue that intolerance is shirk, which is a form of human arrogance and pride which corrupts to death. On the other hand, a friend of mine, Imam Asad Daman, recently sent me a copy of the covenant between the Prophet Muhammad and the monastery of St. Catherine, in which the Prophet is offering a wide range, apparently, of tolerance for Christians. I'm just wondering if the second alternative would be worth looking into and considering, looking at this document and similar documents as a paradigm for religious tolerance in Muslim-majority societies.
Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. I'm not sure I'm the right person to offer an answer to it. But I think it's important to stress in our modern times the necessity of freedom of practice of one's religion. Within the Islamic world, from its origins really, there have been special provisions for non-Muslim people living under a Muslim government. And these provisions do not put the non-Muslim population on an even, how shall we say, an even level with Muslim citizens of the same polity. Now, the good news about that is that within the Islamic world, there was a recognized place of safety for non-Muslim people, especially scripture people or Ahl Kitab, especially Jews and Muslims. If you would contrast that, say, with the Latin West in the Middle Ages, you would not find a comparable situation. But in the long run, this internal Islamic solution to this problem has not proved to be sufficient. So Muslim scholars, Muslim jurists, it seems to me, are called upon to find a way within the Muslim thought itself to accord non-Muslim peoples equal social and political status that would involve freedom of religion. Now, you mentioned the covenant as perhaps one type of document that emanates originally from an Islamic source as being some basis for developing this type of freedom of religious perspective. And the particular covenant you refer to has to do with the monastery of St. Catherine. And in the library of the monastery of St. Catherine, there are several texts that purport to be documents coming from Prophet Muhammad himself, guaranteeing the safety of the monks and the monastery and the general establishment there. The problem is that all of these texts are very late, even from the Ottoman period and just before. So the question of authenticity arises. Can we legitimately think that, in fact, there was a kind of fatwa, let's say, from the Prophet himself guaranteeing this group of Ahl Kitab safety. Well, if we have problems with the authenticity of the document, it's hard to use it to establish the level of political and civil parity that would involve freedom of religion and freedom of religious practice that we would like to see and that the Holy Father calls for, and that the Second Vatican Council, for that matter, already called for in its document on religious freedom. But it seems to me that this is something that has to emerge from the Islamic world itself, amongst those in power, basing their suggestions on the genuine principles of Islamic jurisprudence itself. And we can point to these particular documents as instances in which Muslim authorities in the past have seen it to be Islamically appropriate to offer this level of protection, but a level of protection is not civil and religious freedom or equality. And so it's a difficult issue, but it seems to me it's something that can legitimately be worked out, especially in cooperation between Muslim authorities and non-Muslim groups living within the Muslim world. It seems to me that there's a will among many Muslim intellectuals to think positively in this direction. I don't want to go on at great length, but it's certainly a very important issue.
We have a question right here.
My name is Joe Betts. I'm a retired philosophy teacher here, and I would like to make an informational point and an historical point. The informational point is that the Franciscan Action Network in Washington, together with 4 individuals who have formed an American Muslim production company, have created a 1-hour docudrama entitled The Sultan and the Saint, or maybe it's The Saint and the Sultan. It's about St. Francis of Assisi going to the Middle East during one of the Crusades, becoming welcome to a sultan, talking with him in a sojourn of a week or something like that. It will be premiered in Philadelphia in January, and it is designed to bring about better relations between current Christians and Muslims. My second point is an historic point. It goes back to the 11th and 12th centuries. It's about St. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican member of the Order of Preachers, St. Dominic's Order, who was a great theologian and philosopher of the Catholic Church, roughly in the first 50 years of the 13th century. He was teaching in Paris when monks came back from the Middle East, especially from Baghdad, telling him that Aristotle, who was known as logicus to him because he knew his logical works, had written a metaphysics, on the nature of the soul, a physics. Thomas immediately had those monks translate from Arabic. Aristotle was in Arabic, translated back into Latin, and he became an expert on works that before were unknown in Europe, and it got him into trouble. It got him into trouble because various bishops, Stephen Tempier in Paris, heard that he was teaching Muslim doctrines, and 4 of his theses were condemned. However, he wrote a work, the Summa Contra Gentiles, Summary of Theology, Contra Gentiles, against the Gentiles. The Gentiles were the Muslims. That is, the Summa Contra Gentiles was written for monks to go back to the Middle East, where they would talk to Muslims, they would persuade Muslims, they would have dialogues with Muslim theologians to try to prove that Christianity and the Islamic religion were not absolute enemies. There was concord between them. There could be friends. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arda Aghazarian. I'm here on a Fulbright scholarship pursuing my master's degree in communication I am Armenian, Palestinian, born and raised in Jerusalem, so I'm very delighted to be at this conference, delighted to see fellow Jerusalemites in the room, as well as some friends of my father, I believe, like Mr. Tarek Mitri, who I believe was a classmate of my dad, as well as Rami Khouri. I also see Dr. Anne Lesh, so this is a very good environment for me to be part of. When discussing these issues, which I believe are at the really heart of what's going on in the Middle East today, what is happening to the Christians in the Middle East? Being here in the States, I'm always getting that question about what it's like to be a Christian in the Middle East, and to add to that, being an Armenian from the Middle East, and the shrinking minority in the Middle East, the decline of the Christians in the Middle East, and on and on. I'm always thinking about, well, it's true, it is the shrinking numbers of the Christians, but first of all, this conversation about the Christians being seen as a foreign entity, to me, is sort of offensive, because it takes me back to the time, well, Christianity, it all started kind of there, didn't it? When people ask me about what it's like to be a Christian from Palestine, are there Christians in Palestine? I always remind them, well, Jesus Christ, Bethlehem, does it ring a bell? It all kind of started there, and people forget that. And the other thing it gets me thinking about is, well, what about the secular Muslim majority of the Middle East? Because I think that just like this is alienating to a lot of Christians, it's also alienated to a lot of the Muslims who are also part of Palestine, who don't really fit into that Islamic idea of what Islam is going to be in Islamic societies. A lot of my Muslim friends are just as scared of what these ideas are going to take us, just like the Christians as well. So I think it's important to include that in the discussions as well, rather than count the numbers of Christians, a lot of them who happen to be non-practicing Christians. There are also many Muslims who happen to be also the product of Christian teachings, who share the ethics of Arab society, just like the rest of the society. When I think back about my dad's generation, for example, I cannot tell the difference between the Christian and the Muslim, because that was the generation that shared the same values, irregardless of whether they're Christian or Muslim by name. We're counting numbers and trying to target which one of them is Christian, which one of them is Muslim. The fact is, a lot of them really had the shared values. I think that that is something important to have in mind when having these discussions. Thank you.
A question to Mr. El-Yousef. My memory carries me back about a quarter century, and I recall reading of fist fights between Franciscan choir and their Orthodox counterparts who had joint custody of various holy sites in the Holy Land. Could you please update us in terms of the level of cooperation or non-cooperation within the Christian community in the Holy Land between Catholics on one hand and Orthodox on the other?
I actually missed those days. It was a lot of fun watching the fist fights. It hasn't happened in a number of years. So it is getting much better. And the level of cooperation is at a much, much better pace than what we've seen in a long, long time. I think two examples come to mind immediately. The restoration of the Church of the Nativity, which is still ongoing, but is a project that has been going on for about 3 years, required the full cooperation between the three custodians of the church. And at the present time, today, actually for the past several months, another historic restoration is taking place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Again, this is the first time in 500 years, actually, that the tomb is being restored, and that required the full cooperation and understanding of the three custodians of the Holy Sepulchre. And this could not have been possible maybe 10 or 20 years ago, actually. So there is a lot of cooperation between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches that is ongoing. And you see it in a number of other areas as well, in terms of the services provided within the educational sector. The cooperation in a number of sectors as well has improved dramatically I believe, in the past maybe 2 to 3 decades.
We have a question right here.
Just a question for Mr. El-Yousef. In terms of the story of the Christians in Jerusalem and in Palestine and in Israel in general, what is the role of American evangelicals in this story? And I'm wondering, is there any interaction whatsoever between their, whatever these projects are, these evangelical projects are, and the kind of work that you're doing? Or how do you deal with this question or this problem?
At the present time, it's not really a problem, as I think the majority of the institutional presence continues to be on the Catholic side, in particular, and with some other denominations as well involved. However, there is a push, certainly, of the evangelical churches, and a lot of it really is political, certainly, to the side of the State of Israel. You see parades, for example, in Jerusalem, on Jerusalem Day. The last thing you'd expect, really, is, the Christian evangelical movement parading through the streets of Jerusalem, East and West Jerusalem, basically, or on Jerusalem Day, basically a day that Israel celebrates as uniting the 2 sectors of East and West Jerusalem. However, beyond the political, as far as presence on the ground, it's not that great presence on the ground. However, on the political scene, of course, you see its effects really in the support on the political level to the State of Israel, and that is a huge support, actually, coming from those churches on the political level. And in many ways, it hurts the local indigenous presence. Where do we stand, in a sense? Because for some people would not distinguish. You're Christian and they are Christian, and how do you distinguish yourself as an indigenous, local Christian from these movements, in a sense? And they make our lives, basically, that much more difficult on the ground, day in and day out, with that blind support to the State of Israel. I don't know if Bernard would like to add.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments in general. Islam is a collective identity. At least this is how I see it. I mean, I read Amin Malouf patched, Hawiyat Qatila. And Amin Malouf mentions that we have layers of identities. In the West, if I sleep Catholic, I can wake up evangelical Christian. And nobody would notice that. In Jerusalem, if for some reason, if I wanted to become the president of Palestine, for example, I sleep Catholic and I wake up Muslim, then everybody thinks I'm crazy. Because there is no such thing as individual faith. And some will debate that. But why I'm mentioning that? Because when you talk about freedom of religion is meant for you to practice your religion without my interference. But freedom of religion does not mean that I can become Muslim or you can become Christian, you see. And therefore, the art of survival or being together is how do we respect each other's beliefs, And I think, to be fair, I think many of us respect each other's beliefs, but still masses of people really don't know what is happening on the other side. And therefore, it's much easier to stereotype and say, oh, these blasphemous Christians, Okay, or those infidel Muslims, even though, whatever term you want to use. Now, one thing before talking about the evangelicals, one thing very quickly, a new information, and I don't know if anybody else knows about it. When the Kaaba became a Muslim symbol, an Islamic symbol, place of worship. the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, the followers of Islam, came into Mecca and started destroying the idols that were in Mecca. Now, there was on the wall the icon of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. And some of the believers of Islam said, let us do away with this. And the Prophet himself said, no, you cannot do away with that, because this is a respected and a good representation of Christianity, which is a religion of the book. So I think what happens usually nowadays is we tend to forget the good things that has happened even with the beginning of Islam, and we tend more to stress on the negative. And I think it is meshed into politics, really. The West is against us, so local Christians are West for some. I mean, you have more to do with the West than you have to do with us. So accordingly, we look at you in a different manner. But in reality, this shouldn't be so. And we have to go back to the good traditions. And we shouldn't be selective in saying, oh, Christians is this, or Christians are that, or Muslims are this or that. Finally, on evangelical Christians, I had a chance this semester to teach a course on Palestinian society and politics at a small, I would say, evangelical college in Jerusalem, an evangelical Christian college in Jerusalem. And when I was talking about peace and justice and the need to work for peace and justice in Jerusalem, one student after class told me, Dr. Sabella, I have to inform you that in our church in the Midwest, here in the US, we do not see that work for peace and justice is really a Christian thing. In fact, we see the person who will succeed in doing it is an antichrist. And I said, what do you mean antichrist? This is the evangelical perspective. And she said, well, it is antichrist because the only one who will make peace and justice in the Holy Land and all over the world is Jesus Christ. And so what you are doing is like exactly the Orthodox Jews who argued that the state of Israel with the Zionists usurped the role of the Messiah in creating the state of Israel. That it shouldn't have been done by secular ideologists, but rather it should have been done by the Messiah himself. So what I'm saying is that we do have a problem with evangelical Christians, even though this same student wrote a paper, term paper, in which she mentioned that in a poll taken in 2011 or 2012 among evangelical Christians in the US leaders, the surprising finding was that only 13% of those leaders supported Israel, and 42% are more tending to be equal, to look equal at the situation, with some support for the Palestinian side. The only problem we are having is that many evangelical and other Christians in the US do not realize that in the Middle East you have a good number of Christians, and that we started it all. And let me, if you allow me, just one anecdote very quickly. And it happened here at Franklin Marshall, and allow me to say it, Father Abu Nakir. I was studying my second or third year at Franklin Marshall College here, when some Southern Baptist Bible-yielding man walked up to me. And he said, young man, do you believe in Jesus Christ? I said, yes, I believe in Jesus Christ. Have you been baptized? I said, my parents took me to church and told me they baptized me. No. Have you been immersed in holy water? I said, no, that I haven't. And so he said, then you haven't been baptized. So he came back to me and said, do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you read the Bible? I said, yeah, I have a Bible in Arabic in my room and I read it. No. And then he went back to the idea of believing in Jesus Christ. And I said, how would I get this man off my back? So when again he asked me, do you believe in Jesus Christ? I looked him up in the eyes and said, sir, would you believe me if I tell you not only do I believe in Jesus Christ, but practically Jesus Christ and I grew up in the same neighborhood. And so he walked away.
Okay, you'll notice it's 10 after 12. We did start a bit late, and I see that there is one more question. Are you sure? You're positive?
Okay.
Just one thing. Dr. Griffith mentioned the importance that there's a difference between the protections given to the people of the book in pre-modern times and the understanding of citizens in modern times. One of the things that had the biggest impact on the Roman Catholic Church's attitude to the other was Catholics like John Courtney Murray living in the United States in pluralistic cultures. That had an impact, and there are very many, if you excuse me, I'm slightly denominational here. The Shiites are thinking a lot more about theories of government than our Sunnis. But there are Sunnis, like in the United States, Abdullahi al-Na'im, people like Wa'el Halik, who are actually thinking about how people live faithful to their tradition in a society of religious equals. And I think ultimately that you can't expect that to come from the Middle East right now. They don't have freedom of thought. They haven't had freedom of thought for decades. But there is a Sunni Muslim intellectual community that is doing incredibly good and creative work on how to be faithful to the tradition and still live in a pluralistic world with others as equals. So.
Okay, let me take this opportunity to thank the speakers one last time, and thank you for sharing your morning.